Hey guys, tonight we're easing into a world that's soft, slow, and a little slippery. Picture yourself reclining on a silk-draped couch in the triclinium of a wealthy Roman's villa, just before sunset. The walls are painted with frescoes of nymphs and vineyards, the ceiling flickers with the golden light of suspended oil lamps, and the room smells of warm beeswax, garum, and the faintest trace of wilted violets. A servant passes quietly with a bronze ewer of rosewater for your hands. Another offers you a feathered fan. You nod politely, but your eyes are drawn to the centerpiece of the table, a platter, modest in size, yet humming with promise. Beneath a carefully folded cloth embroidered with cypress leaves, nestled among sprigs of rue and myrtle, lies tonight's opening course, snails. Yes, snails. Not as a joke. Not as a garnish. Not accidentally. These are proud, purposeful, luxurious snails. Plump, fragrant, marinated, and prepared with the kind of reverence usually reserved for pearls or heirs. You probably wouldn't survive this dinner, not because the food is bad, but because the etiquette is exhausting. The Romans took their banquets seriously. And by seriously, I mean, don't you dare eat with your left hand, sneeze during the course of Neptune, or, heavens forbid, ask for extra bread. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop that in the comments if you're awake enough. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the domus of Lucius Marcius Verus, a Roman equestrian who just bought his way into the Senate. He's eager to impress. You can tell by the 12 imported Egyptian ostrich eggs lining the hallway and the way he's hired musicians to play harp versions of bawdy tavern songs. His slaves glide across the marble floor barefoot, their tunics starched and spotless. A young boy holding a silver dish walks with exaggerated care, on it, a spiral arrangement of snails, still in their shimmering, ridged shells, lacquered with oil and dusted in something dark and mysterious. Pepper, maybe. Or cinnamon. You hesitate. You weren't expecting this. You thought it might start with olives or boiled eggs, maybe a bit of cheese. But here it is, cochlea in mensa. Snails on the table. Now, here's the first twist. Romans didn't just pick these things up off the villa path after a rainstorm. These snails were raised like foie gras ducks. And before they even got to your plate, they had a better diet than most Roman citizens. The most prized among them? Snails fed exclusively on milk and flour. Or soaked in mulled wine. Gaius Plinius Secundus, good ol. Pliny the Elder, actually wrote about the finest way to fatten a snail, with milk. He believed it made them softer, more delicate, more elegant. And this wasn't just an eccentric choice. In a world where roasted dormice and fermented fish guts were normal delicacies, snails were a curious kind of prestige food. Rich enough in taste to impress, weird enough to signal worldliness, and slippery enough to discourage amateur diners. You had to know how to eat one gracefully. You couldn't just stab it with your fork. Romans didn't have forks yet, by the way. You had to coax it out with a slender bronze pick, twirl it gently like silk thread, and let it slide across your tongue without dribbling down your chin. You try your first one. It's warm, slightly chewy, slicked in olive oil and honey. There's a touch of something herbal, lovage, perhaps. Maybe thyme. The texture is somewhere between mushroom and oyster, but with a surprisingly smoky aftertaste. Not bad. Definitely odd. And definitely not fast food. It takes time. One snail, one slow bite, one chance to prove you're civilized. Across the table, another guest, a retired centurion, has already finished 4. He dabs the corner of his mouth with a linen cloth and grins. Aphrodisiac, he whispers to no one in particular. You pretend you didn't hear that. The Roman next to him, perhaps a minor magistrate or aspiring poet, counters with a murmured theory that snails prevent hangovers. No one's sure. Everyone keeps eating. The musician misses a note. Someone coughs. A dog barks in the courtyard. The air grows thicker with incense and anticipation. The next course won't arrive for a while. Banquets were measured in hours, not minutes. Sometimes they stretch to dawn. And everything tonight starts with snails. Now, here's your first mainstream historical fact. Snails were so revered in certain Roman circles that people actually built dedicated cochlearia, snail farms, in their gardens. These weren't muddy corners of neglect. They were well-tended stone enclosures with tiny troughs for feeding and little walls to keep the prized specimens from escaping. Think of it as a luxury snail condominium. Some even had roofs to keep out birds. And the most passionate snail breeders? They gave their snails names. Yes. Pets. For eating. And for your quirky tidbit? Some Romans believed that snails not only boosted your energy and your love life, but also soothed stomach problems and even sharpened memory. A triple threat, if ever there was one. Snail smoothies, anyone? Martial, the Roman poet, once joked that snail oil could restore lost hearing. Historians aren't sure if he was being sarcastic, but you'll hear plenty more about that. As for the scholarly debate, historians still argue whether snails were truly a widespread elite delicacy or if their reputation was later exaggerated by a handful of surviving texts. After all, we're mostly relying on Pliny, Apicius, and a few mosaic fragments. And let's be honest, surviving Roman recipe books were more Pinterest board than peasant guide. But the sheer care taken in their preparation suggests they were more than a passing trend. Snails were a statement. Something you served when you wanted to say, "I have arrived." A servant approaches with a delicate clay bowl of warm water and lemon peel for your fingers. Another presents you with a tiny implement, half spoon, half needle. The next round of snails will be baked in ash and served with a vinegar reduction. You're not sure whether to feel nervous or excited. Either way, you take another sip of watered wine and settle back. You recline a little deeper into your cushion, watching the flicker of torchlight on bronze. Somewhere nearby, a servant prepares a fresh batch of snails for the next course, these ones infused with pine nuts and fig syrup. The kitchen must smell like sweet smoke and charred herbs by now. You wonder briefly, when did something so small become so important? The answer is slow. But don't worry, we've got 2 hours to find it. You step into the villa's back garden, barefoot now, because the marble floor inside has given way to warm tiles and crunchy gravel paths, and frankly, your sandals were starting to squeak. The evening air is thick with rosemary and the distant smoke of pinewood fires. Cicadas buzz somewhere in the hedges, completely unaware they're not the most exotic edible thing on the menu tonight. You've left behind the chatter of reclining guests and the clinking of amphorae to follow someone much more interesting, the cook. He's not what you expect. Not round and jolly, not grumpy and flour-dusted. He's wiry, fast-moving, and alarmingly quiet, except when he's whispering instructions to a boy carrying a wooden crate covered with a wet cloth. You peek inside. Snails. Still alive. Still gently oozing their way around fig leaves and bits of cucumber peel like they have no idea they're on death row. You blink. This is not the kind of ingredient you thought required freshness. But here in Rome, you're quickly learning that anything can be elite if you take it seriously enough, and Lucius Marcius Verus takes his snails very seriously. The cook reaches down and selects one. Not the largest. Not the slimiest. He seems to know what he's looking for by touch alone. Too fast, he mutters, placing a particularly energetic one back. Too dry, he rejects another. Finally, he nods at a medium-sized snail curled on a sprig of mint and places it into a clean clay bowl. Selection, it seems, is an art form all its own. These snails aren't just garden pests. They're Helix pomatia, the Roman snail, also called the Burgundy snail or edible snail. Fat-bodied, with cream-antan spiral shells, these creatures are the original slow food. Literally. They move at a pace that makes a sloth look like a sprinter. Which, frankly, makes them perfect for the Roman culinary mindset: the longer something takes, the more it's worth. You follow the cook as he enters a small outbuilding. Part kitchen, part snail spa. The inside is dim, lit by narrow slits in the stone walls. Along the shelves are dozens of shallow trays lined with damp cloths and what looks like stale bread soaked in milk. It's a snail fattening station. You blink again. This is real. Roman gourmands, you learn, didn't just eat snails, they curated them. A snail needed to be properly cleansed, purged of all garden grit, and then plumped like a tiny pastry. The process could take up to a week. Some were soaked in wine, others in honey water, and the most luxurious? Massaged gently in olive oil before being set to rest in ceramic chambers with little windows. Okay, maybe not the olive oil massage. But honestly, after everything else, it wouldn't be the weirdest part. Here's your historical fact for the evening. The Roman naturalist Varro described the existence of large snail breeding operations as early as the 1st century BCE. These weren't just backyard hobbies. Some elite families, like the Fulvii and the Opimii, prided themselves on their snail strains the way modern collectors might rave about vineyards or koi fish. Entire estates were devoted to molluscan husbandry. Snails, it turns out, were not only food, they were family legacy. As the cook lifts a lid from a sealed pot and stirs in a mixture of milk, barley, and chopped herbs, you realize something else: these snails probably eat better than most Roman citizens. And honestly, they smell pretty good. The room is full of warm, sweet, earthy aromas. If you weren't watching closely, you might mistake it for oatmeal. Really fancy oatmeal for something with tentacles. A young assistant scurries in holding a copper basin and points to a cage in the corner. "Those are the Numidian ones," he whispers, with a hint of awe. "Imported snails. From Africa. The culinary equivalent of truffle pigs wearing designer sandals." You glance over, expecting something exotic. They look like snails. Slightly darker shells, maybe, and a little more withdrawn into their coils. But to the trained eye, apparently, they're Michelin star material. And here's your quirky tidbit: the ancient Romans actually categorized snails by region, taste, and size, just like wines. According to Pliny the Elder, the best snails came from Tarquinian, followed closely by those bred in Illyria and the Baetica region of Spain. Some were known for their tenderness, others for their robustness, and some simply for the shine of their shells. It was a slippery taxonomy, but a fiercely competitive one. As you listen to the cook chant off a list of snail classifications like a priest reciting saints, you start to appreciate the obsession. This wasn't just food. It was a ritual, a reputation, and a statement of taste, pun only mildly intended. The boy brings out a fresh bundle of greens. Wild fennel. Marjoram. Dandelion stems. These, you learn, are the cleansing phase. The snails will nibble on these for a day or two to flush out whatever questionable snacks they'd had before entering the snail penthouse. This part was crucial. No Roman wanted a muddy snail. Clean guts meant clean flavor. And nothing says upper class like a well-purged mollusk. You notice a strange-looking amphora tucked behind the fire pit. It's labeled with an unfamiliar word, cochlearium. The boy explains it's a dedicated vessel for keeping snails fresh until serving, basically a fancy snail Tupperware. You suppress a laugh. Even their storage was artisanal. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether this level of snail dedication was widespread among average Romans or restricted to the eccentric elite. While authors like Pliny and Apicius make it sound mainstream, there's little archaeological evidence in everyday homes. Most snail remains found in digs cluster around large villas and banquet halls, not in humble kitchens. So was this gastropod grandeur a cultural staple or an edible flex? Hard to say. Maybe both. Maybe only on payday. Back in the courtyard, the sun is fading into deep ochre. Shadows stretch along the tiled walkways. The snails have been selected, cleansed, and fed. The cook gently places the plumpest few into a bronze pan, drizzles them with olive oil, a touch of garum, and tosses in a pinch of ground cumin. He lets them sizzle just long enough to release their scent, nutty, briny, herbal, and then covers the pan with a linen cloth to let them rest. You breathe in the aroma. It's strangely comforting. Not fishy, not garlicky, not overpowering, just subtle. Earthy. Gentle. Like the idea of eating the forest floor if the forest floor had a skincare routine and a travel visa. Somewhere in the house, a flute begins to play. A new course is about to be announced. But you linger here, among the snails, among the whispering herbs and bubbling pots. The cook wipes his hands on a cloth and gives you a nod. He doesn't smile, but you know. You know he's proud. And now you're starting to understand why. In Rome, even the lowliest creature, if handled with care, if prepared with patience, could become a delicacy worth remembering. Maybe even worth craving. You glance one last time at the snails in their milk-drenched trays. One of them blinks slowly, or maybe it's just inching forward. Either way, it looks serene. Content. Absolutely oblivious to its role in tonight's performance. So are you, honestly. The next morning comes slowly, like a thick curtain drawn over a sleepy stage. You're still in Lucius Marcius Verus' villa, and today, instead of reclining on embroidered cushions and listening to harp players reinterpret tavern songs, you're in the kitchen courtyard again, only now, the air is alive with the sounds of scraping, grinding, whispering, and the occasional disgruntled burp from a pot of simmering lentils. You blink against the sunlight. Somewhere behind the walls, someone is already arguing about time quantities. The snails, however, are completely unbothered. You crouch beside a shallow stone basin where they're slowly, luxuriously wriggling over a mat of lettuce leaves. They've been purging for over 24 hours now, living their best, cleanest lives, nibbling on the herbal equivalent of a spa cleanse. And they are, according to the kitchen's chief assistant, perfectly fat. You lean closer. They don't look like much. Slimy little coils with antennae doing vague windshield wiper motions in the air. But apparently, under the shell, these are meatier than average. Prime snail. The wagyu of mollusks. And they're about to undergo one final transformation, because the best snails aren't just boiled. Oh no. The best snails are stuffed. A bronze tray clinks behind you. The cook returns, bearing a bowl of breadcrumbs soaked in goat milk, finely chopped pine nuts, peppercorns, and what looks like either fish sauce or the tears of an expensive anchovy. He dumps it into a larger mixing bowl with some mashed figs, ground lovage, and a dab of mustard seed. The result smells compelling. Sweet, salty, herbal. Like trail mix that's accidentally stumbled into a perfume factory. You raise an eyebrow. The cook doesn't notice. He's already beginning the delicate process of preparation. Each snail, now well fed and cleaned, is gently coaxed from its shell using a tiny bronze hook. Some resist. Some come willingly. One falls with a moist plop into the stuffing bowl. You try not to flinch. Here's your mainstream historical fact: Roman culinary texts, especially the famous De Re Coquinaria attributed to Apicius, include elaborate recipes for stuffed snails. These weren't rustic snacks. They were elevated courses, often served at the beginning of a meal to stimulate appetite and conversation. The stuffing varied. Some were loaded with peppered wine sauces, others used herbs and dates, and the most luxurious included rare spices from the East, like long pepper or silphium, which, by the way, may have been extinct because of overuse in dishes like this. As the cook stirs the mixture, a slave girl carefully rinses the empty shells in a basin filled with rose-scented water. The snails will be returned to their homes, restuffed like tiny pillows, then roasted gently near coals until warm and just slightly crisp at the edge. Not burned. Not rubbery. The perfect Roman snail should be soft enough to chew but firm enough to hold its shape on a silver pick. And here's your quirky tidbit: some Roman guests like to guess the contents of the snail stuffing as a kind of party game. Was that a touch of date pulp? Did you sense a hint of coriander? Was the shell lined with honey before baking? Losers of the game sometimes had to drink a small cup of vinegar or recite a poem. Winners got more snails. So everyone lost, really. You reach toward the bowl, tempted to try just one fingertip of the stuffing. The cook swats your hand away. Not until it sings, he mutters. You're not sure if he means metaphorically or literally. You decide not to ask. Now, the scholarly debate for this section. Historians still argue whether snail stuffing was a common feature of Roman dining or an eccentric indulgence limited to specific regions or classes. The recipes exist, yes. But they're sparse, and usually written in a tone that suggests, if you can afford this, you know what you're doing. Some scholars suggest it was more of a culinary flex, a Roman chef's way of showing off both their skill and spice cabinet, rather than a household standard. Others argue it may have been more common among the middling elite trying to imitate aristocratic trends. Basically, everyone wanted to be the guy with the best snails. Back at the fire pit, the snail shells are being arranged like chess pieces on a flat stone tray. The cook carefully inserts the stuffing into each shell with a slender reed stick, rotating them slightly to distribute the filling evenly. He pauses at one shell, sniffs it, then tosses it aside. Imperfect. Cracked near the rim. Presentation matters. You wonder briefly if your own kitchen standards would survive this kind of scrutiny. Probably not. Your cutting board is permanently stained with beet juice. The fire is hot now, but not open flame. Just glowing coals, perfect for slow roasting. The tray is set on a bronze stand above the heat, and a piece of damp parchment is placed gently over the top to trap moisture without steaming them limp. The cook folds his arms and waits. You watch. The shells begin to sweat slightly. The scent drifting up is incredible, earthy and nutty and tinged with pepper and something almost floral. You're hungry. And also, mildly ashamed to be hungry. You're craving stuffed snails. It's 78 AD and you're hopelessly bougie. A servant brings over a fresh garland for the centerpiece table. It's made of thyme, bay, and bright yellow rue flowers. Everything about this meal is curated. Intimate. Ritualized. Even the colors of the herbs are chosen to complement the glisten of the snail shells under lamplight. And finally, the moment. The cook lifts a snail from the tray with ivory tongs and places it on a small dish. He motions for you to try. It's still warm. The shell is clean, almost glowing, and the filling peeks slightly out, golden brown and glossy. You use the bronze pick, careful now, no stabbing, and slowly draw the snail from its shell. The meat is firm, but gives with a soft sigh as you pull. You bite. It's surprisingly tender. Rich, slightly sweet from the fig, but balanced by the vinegar tang and a whisper of bitter herbs. The crunch of pine nuts surprises you, and the salt lingers in a way that reminds you of the sea without being briny. You close your eyes. You understand now. The obsession. The ritual. The slow, deliberate preparation. It wasn't about snails. It was about control. About turning something small and slimy and ordinary into something exquisite. Something worth serving with silver tongs and perfumed water bowls. Something worth remembering. As you finish the last bite, a servant appears with a clean linen cloth and a cup of diluted wine. He bows, but says nothing. The snails are ready for the banquet. So are you. Almost. You follow a crooked little path beyond the main villa, past the fig trees and the vegetable plots, until you arrive at what looks, at first glance, like a crumbling stone wall overgrown with ivy. But a closer look reveals something else entirely: rows of smooth-walled compartments, knee-high and neatly stacked. Tiny water troughs run alongside them. The scent in the air shifts too: moist soil, crushed leaves, a faint tang of fermentation. This isn't just a wall. It's a snail estate. This, you realize, is a cochlearia, a Roman snail farm. Not a rustic shed or a slimy crate behind the kitchen, but a fully planned, architecturally intentional piece of mollusk infrastructure. And for a creature that carries its own home, the Romans sure built them some impressive real estate. The snail keeper, a man with a sun-darkened face and hands permanently stained green from herbs, waves you forward. He wears a simple tunic but carries himself like a man who knows his inventory is more valuable than gold. Or at least more interesting than sheep. He stoops and reaches into one of the compartments. His hand comes back out cradling 3 snails, each as large as a walnut, their shells smooth and faintly glistening. He holds them up like trophies. These, he says, almost reverently, are from the Livia strain. He taps one gently. Fed on myrtle and barley paste. Bred from a line going back to the consul's mother's garden. You nod solemnly. It seems appropriate. Nearby, a younger boy is gently scooping stray snails from the path and setting them back into their correct enclosures, whispering to them under his breath like they're small, slimy nobles who've just wandered out of the opera house. No, no, not this way. Back to the time room with you. Now, here's your mainstream historical fact. Ancient Roman naturalists like Varro and Columella did, in fact, write about the keeping and breeding of snails for culinary use. The cochlearia could range from modest backyard beds to elaborate walled enclosures with shade structures, feeding stations, and carefully moistened soil. Some estates bred multiple types of snails in different pens depending on the season, the guest list, or whether the emperor was rumored to be in town. And while you're here standing in front of one, you notice a curious detail. Each snail compartment is labeled, not with names, but with colors. Red wax, green chalk, bits of blue tile. The keeper explains these denote diet regimens. Some are milk-fed. Others have been grazing on fig leaves for the last week. One unlucky group has been on a honey and wine mix that, according to legend, makes the meat sweeter and the shell glossier. You raise an eyebrow. The snails just keep oozing forward, slowly, as if nothing unusual is happening. To the Romans, even the most passive creatures needed order. Structure. A plan. It wasn't enough to eat a snail. You had to know your snail. Where it came from. What it had eaten. Whether it was wild or domesticated. Whether it had enjoyed its final days or been rushed. Even snail pacing was evaluated. Those that moved slower were sometimes deemed fattier, and therefore better. Slowness, in this case, was a virtue. The keeper guides you to a shaded area where broken amphorae have been laid on their sides, half buried in the earth. Snails lounge inside them like tiny emperors. There's a small aqueduct channel nearby that provides a steady drip of fresh water. Ivy grows overhead, providing dappled shade. If reincarnation exists, you think, and you have to come back as a snail, this wouldn't be a bad address. And here's your quirky tidbit: some snail farms included music. No, seriously. Not a concert, but humming, whistling, or flute playing by workers tending the pens. There was a superstition, possibly borrowed from Etruscan lore, that gentle sound encouraged healthy growth. Whether the snails actually listened is debatable, but the humans clearly needed something to do while watching snails digest barley paste in slow motion. And hey, if plants respond to music, why not gastropods? You crouch and peer inside one of the clay compartments. The soil is soft and black, scattered with crushed eggshells and herb stems. A snail is slowly dragging itself across a slice of pear, leaving behind a glistening trail like a lazy calligraphy stroke. You imagine the conversation: "Tell me, chef, was this one time fed or mint brushed?" Because here, even a question like that wouldn't sound absurd. Suddenly, a low whistle pierces the quiet. The keeper frowns. One of the snail pens is missing its lid. A few enterprising snails have made a slow-motion dash for freedom, leaving silvery trails across the path. Escaped nobles, he mutters. You imagine a daring snail prison break in the moonlight. Possibly involving ropes made of lettuce. You chuckle softly. The keeper doesn't. This is serious work. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue how widespread and standardized these cochlearia were. Were they status symbols only found on elite properties, or common features in provincial households as well? Some sources suggest they were as typical as chicken coops, while others imply they were luxuries reserved for the gastropod-obsessed upper crust. The surviving texts are ambiguous. Pliny mentions them casually. Columella describes their care in detail. But the archaeological record? Spotty at best. Some remnants of enclosures exist, but it's hard to say whether they housed snails or just happened to have snails near them. As always, the truth is slippery. You walk slowly past a low stone bench under a bay laurel tree. A servant girl is sitting there with a shallow clay bowl in her lap, carefully brushing snail shells with a cloth dipped in vinegar. Not to clean them. To polish them. These will be served whole, shell and all, so they have to shine under lamplight. They call this the Caesar polish, she jokes without looking up. A flock of sparrows lands on a nearby roof beam and begins chirping frantically. The snails don't react. Of course they don't. They exist on a different timescale. One in which a 7-course banquet is still light speed. You kneel beside one of the troughs. A single snail, glistening in the light, stretches forward toward a slice of apple someone left by the basin. It touches the fruit with the tip of its eye stalk, then begins to feed with a jaw so small it's practically invisible. You stare, mesmerized. This is not fast food. This is food that refuses to be fast. And that, in a world that prided itself on patience and performance, was part of the appeal. A boy runs up from the villa, panting. They're ready for the next course, he says. The keeper nods and selects a basket from a low shelf. Inside, rows of snails nestled in herbs, ready for their short, savory destiny. He hands the basket to the boy and waves him off with a flick of the wrist. You linger just a moment longer. The snail domus is quiet now, save for the occasional drip of water and the soft rustle of leaves. The creatures move in silence, unaware, or perhaps indifferent, to the grandeur they've been swept into. Their lives, short as they are, have been curated. Seasoned. Arranged like poetry. And in their slowness, the Romans found something, worth savoring. Back inside the villa, the atmosphere has shifted. The light is softer now, filtered through sheer linen curtains and scented with the mellow sweetness of warmed honey and crushed mint. Slaves move with graceful urgency, carrying trays of condiments in little ceramic bowls, mustard seeds and vinegar, fig preserves, green olive tapenade, and, because this is a Roman banquet, something that smells suspiciously like fermented fish sauce mixed with wine and optimism. But it's not the trays that draw your attention, it's the scrolls. On a table near the kitchen hearth lies a stack of oil-stained papyrus sheets, rolled at the ends and pinned open by olive wood weights. Beside them is an ink-stained stylus and a bowl of crushed walnut shells used for blotting. The head cook is bent over one of the scrolls, muttering in a rhythm somewhere between prayer and threat. You move closer. At the top of the parchment is a familiar name, Apicius. This, you realize, is not a grocery list. It's a recipe from De Re Coquinaria, the legendary Roman cookbook attributed, perhaps dubiously, to Marcus Gavius Apicius, Rome's most infamous gourmand. A man who spent his fortune on sauces, through feasts so elaborate they were whispered about in the Senate, and, according to legend, once planned to sail to Libya just to taste shrimp, and turned around when he heard they were no better than the ones at home. A man whose death was said to follow the realization he only had 10 million sestertii left, which to him meant poverty. Naturally, He had snail recipes. The cook is reading one aloud now, pacing with a bowl of ingredients in one hand and a sour expression on his face. You listen. Snails, fattened in milk. Purged with herbs. Dressed in pepper, liquamen, lovage, cumin, coriander, honey, and vinegar. Shells to be rubbed with bay oil and served warm. He pauses. Too much cumin, he grumbles, scribbling in the margin. You catch a glimpse. He's adjusted the proportions, reduced the vinegar, and added a note to try pomegranate glaze next time. Here's your mainstream historical fact. De coquinaria contains more than 400 recipes, many of which describe elaborate methods for preparing not only snails, but every form of food imaginable, ostrich, flamingo, sow's womb, and more. The book was more than just a manual, it was a cultural artifact. A manifesto of decadence. A how-to guide for turning dinner into theater. And snails, small as they were, had a starring role in multiple entries. They were versatile. Acceptable at the start of a meal to stimulate the stomach, according to Galen, or even tucked between heavier courses as a palate cleanser. They could be fried, baked, boiled, or grilled. One recipe calls for snails to be simmered in wine until they burst from their shells. Another suggests marinating them in silphium, now extinct, then serving them on skewers with apple slices and crushed nuts. You step into the test kitchen, a semi-covered courtyard with a stone fire pit and racks of copper pans hanging like ancient armor. The air smells of charred citrus and garlic. At the far end, a boy is roasting snails over low coals on a flat pan, flipping them slowly with tongs made of bone. Each snail hisses faintly as it turns, their shells darkening to a glossy, striped finish. Beside him, a more experimental station is underway. A female cook is reducing a thick sauce in a bronze pan, honey, wine, crushed herbs, and dried dates. She tilts the pan forward to let the liquid pool, watching its thickness. Then she picks up a pinch of powdered cheese and sprinkles it in. Cheese. With snails. You blink. She shrugs. Apicius liked to surprise the mouth. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of the lesser-known Apician recipes involves creating the illusion of abundance by disguising a modest portion of food as something extravagant. Snails, due to their compact size and versatile shape, were ideal for culinary trickery. A few shells could be arranged on a gold platter, filled with different seasonings and colored oils, giving the impression of a much grander dish. Roman cuisine wasn't just about taste, it was about spectacle. A banquet was as much about appearances as flavors. If your snail sparkled and steamed just right under lamplight, you were halfway to being a trendsetter. As the cooks finalized their experiments, you're handed a small dish. Just one snail, roasted and presented in its shell. It's been prepared with ground pine nuts, wine-soaked raisins, and a thin drizzle of reduced fish sauce. The shell is slightly cracked, not from mishandling, but because the filling expanded during cooking. You lift it carefully and coax the contents out with a delicate pick. It comes willingly. The flavor is startling. Sweet at first, then tart, then salty, then, suddenly, smoky and smooth. You blink and smile. There's even a little crunch from the nuts, and an almost buttery finish that lingers. It's absurdly good. And you now understand why someone might sail halfway to Libya looking for shrimp if this is what they left behind. The head cook smiles approvingly. Apicius would be pleased, he says. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still dispute how much of de coquinaria was truly Apicius' work. Some suggest it was compiled long after his death, others think it's a collection of household favorites rather than professional gastronomy. The snail recipes, too, may not have been widespread practice, they could have been aspirational. After all, who had time to prepare 5 sauces for 6 snails unless you had 20 slaves, a vineyard, and absolutely no interest in productivity? And yet, here they are. Being followed, recreated, and refined, centuries before the Michelin star existed. As the sun begins to set again and the first torches are lit in the atrium, you stand by the kitchen window, watching the final platter of snails be assembled. This one is purely decorative, shells arranged in a spiral pattern, filled with alternating layers of purple fig paste, orange pepper oil, and crushed almonds. A pomegranate blossom sits in the center. A snail centerpiece. You realize, with a strange mixture of amusement and awe, that you've just spent the last day of your life obsessing over gastropods. Not marching armies. Not sweeping romance. Just snails. And yet here you are, somehow richer for it. You don't know what the next course will be. Maybe peacock tongue or boiled turnips carved to look like roses. But for now, the snails have done their job. They've made you look closer, taste slower, and marvel at just how seriously a civilization can take something so small. And that, in itself, is kind of beautiful. By the time the first full platter of snails enters the triclinium, the dining room has transformed from a gathering space into something that feels more like an open-air theater. Oil lamps, suspended by bronze chains, cast a soft amber glow over the reclining diners. The floor mosaics, depicting Neptune riding a dolphin, seem to shimmer as if the gods themselves are leaning in. Conversations hush. All eyes turn to the host, who, at this moment, is not merely a man. He is a conductor. And his orchestra? A spiral of golden-shelled snails on a silver platter. Lucius Marcius Verus carries it himself. That in itself is significant. In a world where touching your own food before the slaves do is considered gauche, Verus is making a statement. He's cradling the tray like a priest bearing sacred relics. The snail shells glisten, their edges flecked with edible gold, their interiors lined with oils and herbs and, if the gossip is true, just a hint of imported cinnamon from Syria. You can feel the temperature in the room shift. Not physically, but socially. Everything now centers on these snails. And this is the point. In ancient Rome, food was currency, yes, but more than that, it was conversation. It was positioning. Serving something rare and difficult to prepare, like properly bred, purged, and seasoned snails, was the culinary equivalent of flexing your toga sleeve and revealing you've got a senator's signature inked on your inner arm. Here's your mainstream historical fact: banquets among the Roman elite were often multi-hour, multi-course affairs where social standing could rise or fall based on how you responded to the meal. Dining order was dictated by status. Who got the biggest cut of roasted peacock? Not random. Who got offered second helpings of snails? Watched closely. Even the way you held your wine cup, or failed to, was noted. Snails, being exotic, small, and slippery, were perfect litmus tests for refinement. Verus begins with a short speech. He doesn't brag, that would be too obvious, but he casually drops phrases like cochlearia fed and herb-infused barley paste. Someone asks if the snails were wild or domesticated. He smiles. These haven't known wilderness in 4 generations. A few guests murmur in approval. One actually applauds. Another, clearly angling for favor, asks if Verus plans to publish his breeding notes. In time, he replies. Good strains deserve good scribes. Then, as if on cue, the tray begins its slow rotation around the room. The first bite is not about taste, it's about posture. You watch a senator in pale blue silk lean forward just slightly, taking his snail with the elegance of a man plucking a coin from a wishing fountain. He doesn't look at it. He doesn't sniff it. He simply twirls it from the shell with a bronze pick and places it into his mouth as though it were a political truth, small, dense, and entirely non-negotiable. The younger men watch him. One mimics his angle. Another mimics the mimic. You can see the hierarchy forming like a tide pool, tiny, silent, predictable. Now here's your quirky tidbit: Roman etiquette manuals, yes, they existed, suggested that eating a snail too quickly was a sign of poor breeding, while taking too long was a sign of vanity. You had to strike the perfect balance between appreciation and efficiency. No slurping. No double dipping. And absolutely no grimacing. In fact, grimacing at any course was a social crime punishable not by law, but by a lack of future dinner invitations. Which, in Roman society, might as well be exile. And exile was exactly what no one here could afford. You glance across the room and catch sight of Gaius Fabius Maximus, wealthy, married well, hopelessly dull. He's halfway through his snail, trying to chew slowly, but his eyes betray the truth, he's struggling. A few other guests notice. One even covers his mouth with his napkin to hide a smile. Poor Maximus. One poorly handled snail, and his social ranking is already wobbling. Here's the scholarly debate. Some historians argue that the Roman obsession with food, particularly elaborate banquets, was a post-republic phenomenon, born of peace and boredom in the imperial age. Others suggest it was always there, even during the austere days of early Rome, just hidden under layers of practicality. Snails, they argue, rose to fame not because of their taste, but because they could be cultivated, manipulated, displayed. They were symbols of domestication, of luxury, of control. Still others think snails were simply fashionable because they were weird. And Romans loved weird. A younger guest, dressed in a toga that's just a little too white and too freshly pressed, leans in your direction. Did you notice, he says conspiratorially, Verus served the Numidian snails before the Tarquinians? You hadn't. But now you do. That order says everything. Numidian snails, imported from Africa, were rare, harder to breed, slightly gamier in taste. Serving them first was a flex. Tarquinians were more traditional. A gesture toward heritage. This wasn't a meal. It was narrative structure. Clever, the young man murmurs, he's signaling novelty, then stability. Risk, then roots. You nod. He's not wrong. These snails are basically edible metaphors. Now the tray comes your way. A young slave offers it with steady hands, eyes low, posture perfect. You lift a shell. It's slightly warm. The edge glistens. You smell thyme and smoke and the faintest trace of vinegar. You draw the snail from its shell and let it rest on your tongue. The texture is soft, yielding, but with a backbone of umami that surprises you. It's perfect. Balanced. Tiny. Powerful. Like a whisper that somehow drowns out a crowd. Across the room, another man drops his shell. It lands on a silver dish with a sharp clink. Heads turn. One guest tuts. Another winces. Verus doesn't react, but his hand tightens slightly on the arm of his couch. Too loud. Too careless. Not invited back. Now for one more joke before dessert. One Roman poet once wrote that a man could be measured not by the weight of his purse or the size of his villa, but by how elegantly he extracted a snail from its shell without making a sound. That poet, of course, died penniless, but he was right. Back at your seat, the next tray is arriving, this time with snails stuffed with cheese and leeks, their shells coated in garum caramelized with honey. Verus raises his glass. To the slow ones, he says. Everyone laughs. You laugh too. Because now you understand the game. These aren't just snails. They're politics. They're ambition. They're theater. And you, my friend, are part of the act. The room has settled into its rhythm now, that drowsy middle stretch of a Roman banquet when the wine is flowing, the laughter is slightly too loud, and everyone's reclining just a bit deeper into their cushions. Conversation grows circular. Someone is repeating a joke you heard earlier in the evening, only now with more gesturing and fewer verbs. And through it all, the silent choreography continues. Slaves. They move like shadows across the mosaic floor, practiced and near invisible. Barefoot, silent, synchronized. Their tunics are pale and spotless, deliberately so, to contrast against the dark marble, to make their presence seem ghost-like. You notice it now, with the wine in your blood and the snails still warming in your stomach. The banquet has two castes, those reclining on couches with cups in hand, and those tiptoeing around them, bearing trays, ladles, towels, and shame. Here's your mainstream historical fact: Roman banquets relied entirely on slave labor. Every dish, every pitcher, every decorative fig leaf tucked beside a bowl of olives passed through the hands of people with no names in the seating plan. While the elites debated snail pairings and recited love poems to dormice, it was enslaved boys and girls who gutted the fish, stirred the sauces, fanned the guests, and scrubbed the snail shells to a mirror sheen. And yet, their presence was designed to vanish. If a guest noticed a slave too much, it meant something had gone wrong: a dropped tray, a smudge on a dish, a moment of hesitation. Everything had to be seamless. Effortless. Perfect. You watch one boy, no older than 12, refill wine goblets with the steadiness of a seasoned surgeon. He leans forward with just enough bend to avoid spilling, retracts his arm like a ribbon, and disappears behind a curtain before the senator beside you finishes blinking. Another servant carries a tray of snails so delicately you'd think he was transporting Faberge eggs. He pauses at each couch, offering the platter at just the right height, just the right angle, his eyes never meeting yours. Not once. And what's on those platters tonight? A work of edible art. Snail shells, arranged in concentric circles, each painted with oil and lightly dusted with saffron. Between them, sprigs of rosemary and lemon leaves for color. A drizzle of fig glaze across the center, pooling ever so slightly into the ridges of the silver. They don't just look appetizing. They look wealthy. And here's your quirky tidbit: some Roman hosts went so far as to polish their snail shells with powdered pearls or dust them with gold before serving, literally feeding their guests food decorated with money. The logic? If it sparkles, it must be good. And if it's edible, all the better. There were even rumors of snail shells being dyed purple, the imperial color, just to impress visiting dignitaries. Granted, the dye wasn't always food safe, but who was checking? One guest gestures for a refill. A female slave arrives with a pitcher and pours with a soft tilt. He doesn't thank her. Instead, he flicks a grape stem from his plate onto the floor. She steps back without blinking. Someone nearby chuckles. You feel a brief rush of something: discomfort, guilt, maybe just awareness. This snail, this perfect bite nestled in gold and herbs, came from hours of invisible hands and unseen effort. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians still argue to what extent slaves in Roman households were treated as extensions of luxury versus autonomous individuals. Some elite families gave their culinary slaves names, training, even engraved tools. Others rotated them in and out like kitchen furniture. In texts, they're often mentioned only when something goes wrong: a spoiled dish, a broken cup, a stain on the host's dignity. And yet archaeological digs have uncovered personal items in slave quarters: carved figurines, scraps of poetry, tiny charms. Even under the weight of obedience, there was individuality. Hidden lives beneath the sandals. Back at the center of the room, Verus claps once, softly. A slave boy emerges carrying a single dish, one snail, perfectly centered, shell lacquered, steam rising gently like incense from a temple altar. It's placed before a guest of honor, a portly man with narrow eyes and a reputation for owning more vineyards than he has teeth. He picks up the shell, turns it in his fingers, and, God's help us, sniffs it like a jewel merchant inspecting a ruby. A long pause. Then he nods. Acceptable, he declares. A cheer rises. Someone toasts to the snails. Again. You take your next bite. This one's different, braised with celery root and pine nuts, finished with a splash of raisin wine. It's chewy but rich, with just enough sweetness to make you forget you're eating something that once glided along garden walls. You close your eyes. There's laughter all around. Someone's quoting poetry. Someone else is singing a verse about a snail's journey up a lover's arm, scandalous, but technically metaphorical. And still, the slaves move. A girl clears discarded shells from a low tray without interrupting the conversation above her. Another boy lights a new oil lamp with a taper no thicker than a reed. One man, older and slower, carries a basket of fresh herbs for garnish. His tunic is worn. His hands are scarred. But he moves with the same silence as the rest. No one speaks to them. Not out of cruelty, necessarily. But because they are part of the furniture now. Like the marble columns. Like the lyre music drifting in from the atrium. Like the snails themselves, arranged, admired, consumed. You take another sip of wine. It's beginning to taste flat. Not because it's bad, but because you're thinking too much. About the hands that crushed the grapes. The backs that stirred the snail stuffing. The bare feet brushing across chilled tiles while everyone else feasts and flirts. One of the younger guests fumbles a snail. It slides off his plate and hits the floor with a soft pat. Before anyone can react, a slave is there, kneeling, scooping it up, replacing it with a fresh one. No comment. No eye contact. Gone in seconds. Too efficient to be seen. And now, here's your final thought before the next course arrives. The snails may be slow, but everything around them moves fast. Prestige, power, punishment. The men on these couches will sleep soundly tonight, bellies full of gastropods and pride. The ones who serve them will sleep too, but on straw mats, behind kitchen walls, dreaming maybe of gardens. Or of silence. Or of what it might feel like to eat the food they spend their lives perfecting. You lean back, full now. Of snails. Of questions. Of something heavier than you expected. And the banquet continues. By now, your body is melting into the cushions. You are no longer a person reclining, you are simply part of the furniture. The flicker of oil lamps has dulled into a golden pulse against your eyelids, and the smell in the room, roasted herbs, sweet wine, smoke, and sweat, is so dense you feel like you could chew the air. The music has slowed to something ghostly. You haven't heard a harp string in minutes. Only the low murmur of a flute being half-heartedly coaxed back into life, and the occasional burp being disguised as polite laughter. And still, the snails arrive. This time, they're arranged like precious offerings, shells painted with edible gold, tucked onto tiny fig leaves, dusted with rose petals and glazed with honeyed wine. The tray floats between reclining guests like a sacrament. No one says the word, but everyone is thinking it, aphrodisiac. Or, if you're less charitable, digestive dare. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In Roman medical thinking, rooted in Galenic humoral theory, certain foods were said to stoke desire, especially those considered moist, cold, and rich in natural phlegmatic essence. Snails, being all of those things and a little more, were believed by some to restore vigor, rouse sluggish appetites, of every kind, and rebalance a weary constitution. A senator lifts his shell in salute. To virility, he shouts. His neighbor adds, to accidents we don't regret. Across the room, a woman raises her cup. To pretending it works. Laughter trickles around the couches, slow and syrupy. No one quite believes it. Everyone enjoys pretending they do. You peer down at your plate. One snail glistens like a secret. You lift it gently, rotate the shell under the light. It smells faintly of cinnamon, thyme, and something floral, perhaps too floral. You draw the meat out with the small bronze pick. It uncoils obligingly, soft and glossy. You chew. It's sweet. Slick. Slightly chewy. It tastes like something trying to be seductive and just barely pulling it off. Like a love letter written in olive oil. Not unpleasant. Not persuasive. Just, slow. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Pliny the Elder, ever the enthusiast for questionable remedies, believed snails could cure ulcers, ease coughing fits, promote sleep, and even regenerate skin. Their mucus, collected raw, was said to soothe sore eyes and ward off baldness. A paste made from snail ash and vinegar could allegedly remove warts. Aphrodisiac properties? He never directly confirms. But the Romans were experts at drawing suggestive conclusions from anything vaguely slimy. Someone near you coughs discreetly. Another guest has started singing a poem about a snail on a lover's shoulder. The verse contains the words, curling, moist, and yearning, in rapid succession. You decide not to listen too closely. A servant passes with another tray. This time featuring snails baked in pastry, glazed with pomegranate and paired with slices of pear. The pleasure course, the server announces quietly. You don't know if he means the food or what's supposed to follow. Now for the scholarly debate. Historians remain divided on whether the Roman association between snails and desire was a serious cultural belief or just another culinary joke that got carried away. Some ancient texts offer medical reasons. Others, like the poet Martial, reference snails in more humorous contexts. It's unclear if Romans truly expected snails to ignite passion, or if they just found them useful metaphors for longing that took its time. The music fades to near silence. Somewhere, someone is snoring. A guest stands and drifts out of the room with a soft word and a hand trailing behind them. Another follows. No one makes eye contact. A woman leans toward you and whispers, "If the snails don't work, try fig syrup and flattery." She smiles, leans back, and disappears into a silk shadow. You reach for another snail, not because you believe, not because you want, but because your fingers are moving before you can stop them. The meat is softer now, practically melting. The flavor is indistinct, like all the others, but more tired. You don't finish it. Your stomach has stopped protesting. It has moved into resignation. A calm surrender. You wonder if that, too, is part of the effect. Across the room, the host Vera stands slowly and announces, "May we all leave tonight with something rekindled." Another round of laughter. Someone toasts to manageable consequences. A nearby guest grins. To functioning digestion. You glance at your plate again. A final snail remains, untouched, shining faintly under the lamplight. You watch the tiny ring of oil around it. It reflects your own face in strange distortions. You don't reach for it. You recline further. The pillow beneath your head smells like thyme and sandalwood. Your limbs are warm, heavy, distant. You begin to wonder if the real aphrodisiac was never the snail, never the honey or the rosewater or the saffron dust, but the slow ritual of eating something you don't fully understand, with people you barely know, in a room that feels suspended in time. Maybe desire doesn't live in the snail. Maybe it lives in the suggestion. In the silence between verses. In the glance over a goblet's rim. In the act of choosing to believe, just for an evening, that food can do more than feed. That it can wake something in you. Or at least distract you from how long it's been since you felt anything that moved slowly, deliberately, toward joy. Someone yawns. Someone giggles. A servant sweeps by and replaces your empty plate with a small dish of mint leaves and fennel seeds. No one eats them. They're not meant for eating. They're a signal, this course is done. The room has quieted. Verus walks the perimeter slowly, nodding to guests half asleep on their elbows. The slaves begin collecting empty shells with padded fingers. The gold on some has flaked off and sticks to their hands like pollen. They say nothing. They do not comment on the fact that the final course of snails, meant to stir the passions of Rome's most refined, has instead lulled most of them to the edge of slumber. The music ceases. The air grows still. One man is murmuring something about a dream he had in which a snail carried him across the sea. His companion nods, as if this is reasonable. You glance again at the last snail on your plate. It is still there. Still warm. Still waiting. You do not touch it. You let it rest, undisturbed. Like a prayer you no longer need to say aloud. Like a desire you no longer need to chase. Like a small, quiet thing that came with promise, and stayed for peace. The next course doesn't come with fanfare. No flute melody. No elaborate announcement. Just the gentle slide of polished sandals against stone as a servant enters carrying a wide, flat tray that looks more like a map than a meal. You blink slowly, eyes adjusting to the soft shimmer of oil lamp reflections gliding across ceramic tiles. 6 sections, each neatly divided, each with a small clay label scratched in hasty Latin. Tarq. Numi. Ili. Gaul. Brit. Carth. You stare at the labels and try to guess which part of the empire will taste like regret. Verus rises again, arms extended like an orator, but with the practiced theatricality of a man who's performed this exact speech more than once. Friends, he says, his voice rising just slightly above the soft rustle of togas and tired laughter, tonight we dine not only in Rome, but on it. A few guests chuckle. A few groan. Someone murmurs, not again. You say nothing. You are already bracing for the idea of imperialism, served boiled with fennel. The first snail is Tarquinian. Local, tame, smooth in texture, lightly perfumed with rosemary and just enough black pepper to remind you you're awake. It's safe. It's diplomatic. It tastes like compromise. A baseline for comparison. You chew slowly and swallow even slower, wondering how this became normal. Beside you, someone whispers that Tarquinian snails are best fattened on barley porridge and fig leaves. You nod thoughtfully, as if you've always believed that. The second is Illyrian. Thicker shell, darker meat, an unexpected mineral edge that makes you think briefly of iron and river stones. Briny, someone says. Almost fish-like. Someone else adds, that one's for real men. He proceeds to drop his onto the floor. It rolls under a couch and is promptly forgotten. The third is Numidian, earthy, dense, and rich with something smoky you can't quite place. The sauce is darker, sweetened with grape must, and clings to the snail like memory. You chew and feel the weight of the Sahara for no reason. It tastes like heat, like sand, like nostalgia you didn't earn. A woman beside you sighs and says, I'd eat 1,000 of these. Her husband stares at her like he's just discovered betrayal has a flavor. Then comes the Gallo-Roman. The shell is paler, flecked with ochre. The meat inside is soft, bordering on mushy, but the glaze, smoky pine and something tart, possibly fermented apple, makes up for the texture. Tastes like rebellion, someone jokes. You can't tell if they mean the snail or the sauce. You're beginning to forget what rebellion even tastes like. Now comes Britannia. The snail is small, tightly coiled, and faintly gray. No one looks excited. It's served with a dab of mustard, of course it is. Everything from Britannia arrives with mustard and a slightly defensive attitude. You bite in. It's chewy, stubborn, but not unpleasant. The aftertaste is odd, like rain-soaked leaves and overboiled cabbage. Reminds me of my first posting, a retired centurion says, swirling his wine. Miserable and cold, but strangely memorable. Someone else chuckles. Someone else sneezes. A third person pours more wine and pretends they're somewhere warmer. Finally, Carthage. The snail gleams under lamplight, its shell polished and dark. The sauce is pomegranate vinegar, sharp and assertive, with a background note of toasted coriander. The flavor is intense, layered, a little tragic. You don't chew this one. You let it linger, let it melt, let it whisper the ghost of empire. Someone says it tastes like defeat. Someone else says it tastes like victory. Someone else shrugs and says, tastes expensive. Now for your mainstream historical fact, as Roman territory expanded, so did its culinary ambitions. Trade routes stretched from Spain to Syria, carrying spices, oils, fruit, and snails. Not just as cargo, but as cuisine. Roman snail breeders weren't content with local species. They wanted variety. They wanted the exotic. They wanted to taste the edges of the map. There are records of snail pens being established in Gaul, in North Africa, even in Britannia. Not muddy backyard pens, mind you, but well-maintained enclosures, some with feeding troughs lined with stone. Think of them as luxury mollusk condos, complete with diet plans and property boundaries. And for your quirky tidbit, some Roman military outposts built snail farms not just for food, but for comfort. Snails were slow, familiar, reliable, an edible reminder of home in a cold, barbarian frontier. A few letters from Roman soldiers even request a jar of Tarquinian cochlea, live, fed on parsley and milk. Which is either a testament to homesickness or proof that the human palate has always been deeply weird. Pliny even claimed that snails could clean the blood and sharpen the memory. He never explained how. But he said it often. Here's the scholarly debate: were all these regional snails really different, or was the distinction mostly theatrical? Some historians argue the actual species may have been nearly identical, and it was only the preparation, sauce, seasoning, story, that created the illusion of variety. Others insist that soil, diet, and local herbs did produce real distinctions in flavor and texture. Still others point out that Roman menus were more about signaling status than reflecting biological nuance. It's from Numidia, a host might say, pointing at a snail that never left Lazio. Guests would nod knowingly. No one would ask questions. That's how flavor worked, like theater. A tray of condiments circulates now, bowls of myrtle vinegar, mint oil, sea salt, and powdered cumin. You try each snail again, modifying flavor like an alchemist with edible metals. The Numidian with honey becomes rich and decadent. The Gallo-Roman with salt tastes like a rainy autumn in Lyon. The Carthaginian dipped in mint oil. Weird. Somehow angry. You eat it anyway. A few guests are murmuring quietly about where their favorite snail came from. One insists that Gaulish snails are best because of the wine in the soil. Another claims Britannia's are hardier, because everything there fights to live. Someone else just closes their eyes and says, I like the ones that taste like thyme. You decide not to ask what that means. And suddenly you realize, this isn't just dinner anymore. It's a geography lesson disguised as indulgence. It's the empire on a platter, one spiral at a time. Rome didn't just conquer land. It chewed it. Swallowed it. Seasoned it. Served it. The tray is cleared. The map is gone. Someone reads a line from Virgil about land and longing. Someone else snores. A dog barks again in the courtyard. You shift slightly in your seat, the silk cushion sighing beneath you like a tired breath. Your stomach feels strangely content. Your tongue feels like it's traveled farther than your feet ever will. You wonder, not for the first time, how a creature so slow became a symbol of ambition. How something so silent made its way into poetry, into power, into your memory. There is one snail left. Unmarked. The label has rubbed off in the heat. No one claims it. No one reaches for it. You stare at it. It stares back. You lift it gently, slide the pick in, and pull. It tastes like all of them. It tastes like Rome. You're still licking pomegranate vinegar from the corner of your lip when another tray arrives, and this one is conspicuously plain. No fanfare, no sculpted garnish, no speech from Verus. Just a flat wooden board, slightly scorched at the edges, upon which rests a modest pile of snails roasted in their shells. No gold leaf. No garum glaze. No wine reduction or fig compote or imported saffron pollen. Just salt, olive oil, and heat. It's almost jarring. After hours of being wined, lectured, and ceremonially fed, this feels like an interruption, a pause in a theater. And yet it draws your attention more than all the painted sauces and poetry did. Because this tray is different. These snails look normal. The guest beside you is the first to notice. A woman of indeterminate age and excellent posture, she leans slightly forward, squints, and murmurs, "These are street snails." Not with disgust. With curiosity. You take one, slowly, carefully. The shell is rougher than the others. The meat is smaller. The seasoning is minimal. You pop it into your mouth. And then you pause. It's good. Not revelatory, not exotic, but honest. Warm, chewy, lightly crisped on the edge. It tastes like someone who knows how to cook without trying to impress. It tastes like something made in a real kitchen, on a real fire, by someone whose name isn't recorded in any poem. Here's your mainstream historical fact: by the late 1st century CE, snails had begun to crawl their way down the Roman social ladder. No longer confined to elite banquets and Pliny's musings, they became a fairly common street food in many Roman cities, especially in Italy and Gaul. Farmers raised them. Soldiers ate them. Children collected them. In fact, snail stalls were found tucked between spice vendors and bread bakers in city markets, simple stands with stone braziers, where customers could order a handful of snails grilled with herbs, served in a scrap of cloth or a small cup. For a few copper coins, you could eat like a senator, just without the embroidery and harp music. And this isn't just a guess. Archaeologists have uncovered middens, those ancient piles of trash and bone and broken pottery, that contain vast quantities of snail shells, often burned, cracked, or blackened from roasting. Some were found near elite villas, yes, but many were unearthed in tenement zones, near public baths or small shop fronts. Places where wealthy Romans rarely lingered. Which means that sometime, somewhere, someone decided that snails weren't just a delicacy. They were dinner. Across the room, one of the younger guests is talking. He's recounting a trip to Ostia, where he claims he watched two street vendors get into a shouting match over snail freshness. One swore his were bathed in milk, he says, grinning. The other said his had never known captivity. Someone else jokes that the best snails are the ones that don't know they're being eaten. Laughter. A few raised cups. Then someone says, "It's all just marketing anyway." And the room nods as one. Your quirky tidbit. Some evidence suggests that snails were even used in Roman taverns as a kind of edible gambling chip. Patrons would wager snails in drinking games, he who lost had to eat the ugliest one. Others placed bets on which snail would reach the edge of a platter first. There are crude graffiti drawings in Pompeii of racing snails with names like Spedius Maximus and the Gooey Gladiator. One tavern wall even includes tally marks and what appears to be a snail race bracket, scratched alongside a vulgar limerick and a very bad drawing of something that might be a goat. Whether it was all in jest or part of some drunken local ritual, no one knows. But it paints a picture of snails not as sacred objects, but as part of life. A food that could be mocked, bet on, or devoured without reverence. A servant arrives with more of the rustic tray and sets it down with a thud. You watch as several guests, those who had previously turned up their noses at any course not preceded by a speech, reach for these snails without hesitation. Maybe it's the hour. Maybe it's the wine. Or maybe it's something simpler, hunger that doesn't care about marble floors and imported linen. And here's your scholarly debate: did snails become common because of popularity, or because of practicality? Some historians argue that as the empire's urban population exploded, demand for cheap protein sources drove the spread of snail farming. Others believe it was more cultural. Snails retained their elite reputation just long enough to make them aspirational for the middle and lower classes. A kind of culinary trickle-down effect. Still others think it had less to do with food and more to do with economics. Snail farming was a low-barrier entry point for freedmen and poor farmers hoping to profit from Rome's ever-growing appetite. In short, were snails democratized, or just commodified? You lift another from the tray. It's darker than the rest, its shell marked by fire. You bite into it. It tastes like thyme and ash. It tastes like something cooked outside, with hands that have dirt under the nails and a fire that burns unevenly. It tastes like simplicity. And you like it. A young servant walks past, humming to herself. You recognize the tune. It's not the refined melody the harpists played earlier, but something you've heard in alleyways and farmyards, something people sing while chopping herbs or waiting for dough to rise. And suddenly, the connection clicks. This course isn't just a novelty. It's a nod. A reminder. That food travels. That recipes migrate. That the same snail that once slid onto Caesar's plate might also end up in a wooden bowl in a smoky tavern, eaten by someone whose name never made it onto a mosaic floor. Across the empire, in the provinces, on farms, in garrisons, snails filled bellies in ways bread could not. They were hearty, forgiving, strangely satisfying. In Gaul, they were boiled with leeks and mustard. In Hispania, grilled with garlic and dipped in vinegar. In North Africa, tossed with date syrup and cumin. Each version slightly different. Each version slightly familiar. You wonder how many of those people, farmers, soldiers, mothers, merchants, ever knew that they were eating something once served under marble arches and golden light. Or if they even cared. The room is quieter now. The air hangs heavy with wine, with salt, with the faint scent of burnt rosemary. You recline deeper, the silk beneath you now warm with body heat and story. The last of the humble snails are gone. The tray is taken away without comment. But their taste lingers, not in your mouth, exactly, but somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. One final thought comes to you as your eyes drift halfway closed. Maybe luxury is just memory with seasoning. Maybe what starts as elite becomes ordinary, and what was once rare becomes comfort. And maybe, just maybe, a snail, humble, slow, overlooked, can carry a culture, if you give it long enough. The wine has gone warm in your cup, and the air has grown heavy with incense, not festive now but something bordering on sacred. You lean back against your cushion, wondering if the flicker in the torchlight is just oil smoke or if the shadows have started to move with purpose. A servant glides into view, not with food, not even with wine, but carrying a small bronze basin of water, and floating inside it are delicate petals and one living snail. Another servant follows behind, bearing a small terracotta figure of Ceres, her robes etched in faint lines, her arms extended in the gentlest gesture of offering. The table still smells faintly of vinegar and pine nuts, but now it's mingled with frankincense and rose. Something in the mood has shifted. It's no longer just about pleasure. It's about meaning. You glance at Verus. He does not speak this time. He simply nods, once, solemnly. The chatter dulls, then dies. You feel the hush like a blanket being drawn over the room. A new snail is brought forward, not marinated, not pickled, not baked in ash. It is alive, slow, glistening, unbothered. You're told, by no one in particular and yet by everyone at once, that this snail is not for eating. This one is for watching. The guest nearest you, an older man with liver spots and golden rings stacked on every knuckle, leans toward you. His breath smells of honeyed cardamom. The slowest creatures, he whispers, often carry the heaviest omens. You nod automatically, as if you've always believed that. You don't. Not yet. But it's hard to argue when the whole room seems to believe, when the flickering lamps cast long, reverent shadows, and when every eye follows the path of this creature like it's trailing more than slime behind it. The Romans, you're learning, didn't separate the sacred from the mundane the way modern people do. A snail was not just a dish. It was also a message. Maybe even a god's whisper. Snails, emerging after rain, were seen as symbols of rebirth, fertility, the promise of harvest. Their preference for damp soil and hidden corners made them natural agents of the chthonic, beings tied to the underworld, to cycles, to secrets. They were believed by some to predict weather. By others, to mark thresholds of transition. If you found a snail crawling on your threshold in the morning, you didn't kill it. You waited. You watched. You interpreted. There's a story, of uncertain origin but often told, of a priestess in southern Italia who once refused to begin the autumn harvest rites until a snail appeared from beneath the altar. She waited 3 full days. No wine was poured. No grain cut. When at last the snail emerged, timid, glistening, and unbothered, the crowd erupted in cheers. That year's harvest was said to be the best in a generation. Whether it was due to patience, superstition, or simply the timing of the rain, no one could say. But after that, no ceremony began without at least one snail sighting. It became law, or something close to it. Now for your mainstream historical fact, the Roman religious calendar was riddled with festivals dedicated to the gods of agriculture, and in these celebrations, offerings were made, not only of grain and oil, but of soil-dwelling creatures. Ceres, Tellus, Ops, Saturn, they were not high and aloof deities. They were gods of the dirt, the field, the slow. In rural regions, people would offer symbolic tokens from the earth to honor the gods, twisted roots, snails, moss, clay vessels filled with worms. There are even records in Pliny's natural history describing farmers who buried live snails at the corners of their fields in the spring as a promise, feed the earth something gentle, and it might feed you back. That wasn't sacrifice, it was reciprocity. Here's your quirky tidbit. In household shrines uncovered in Pompeii and Herculaneum, archaeologists have found tiny amulets shaped like snails. Some are carved from bone, others from glass or terracotta. And on a few of them, especially those worn as rings or sewn into children's tunics, there's a small Latin inscription, Tardus et certa. Slow, but certain. The phrase appears elsewhere too, in graffiti, in wax tablets, in whispered advice to nervous senators preparing for speeches. The snail, bizarrely, became a mascot for resilience. Not brilliance. Not speed. Just persistence. There's even one mosaic where a snail is depicted crawling beside a phallus and an eye, symbols of fertility and vigilance, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, this little mollusk had a more potent symbolic life than we give it credit for. And now for the scholarly debate. Were snails truly revered in a spiritual sense, or have modern archaeologists simply fallen in love with a clever narrative? Some scholars caution that we may be overinterpreting, pointing out that in many contexts, the presence of a snail could be incidental, even pest-like. After all, gardens in ancient Rome were full of them, and not everyone was pleased to see them. Yet others argue that their repeated appearances in sacred architecture, household charms, and feast day poetry suggest something deeper. In particular, they cite the Fasti, the Roman poem cycle by Ovid, which hints at nature's slow signs as divine ticks on the great cosmic clock. Could the humble snail have been one of those? Could a trail of silver mucus really have been seen as prophecy? Back in the triclinium, the snail continues its dignified crawl across a fig leaf placed in the center of a small dish. No one touches it. No one speaks. And then, almost without effort, it starts to climb the edge of the bowl. A few people gasp softly. A woman near the corner makes the sign of the horns with her fingers, an old protection gesture. A man opposite her nods slowly, then places a coin near the snail. An offering? A bribe? You're not sure. All you know is that in this moment, the room feels weightless. Like time itself has slowed to match the pace of the snail. The servant retrieves the dish with the utmost care, cradling it like a newborn. Someone mumbles a short line from Virgil. Another repeats it, then forgets the second half. A musician strums a lyre softly, plucking notes that feel more like memory than melody. You sip your wine and feel its warmth crawl down your throat like something alive. You glance to your left and notice a wax tablet resting beside a young guest's hand. She has drawn a snail, but with wings, as if to say, even slow things dream of flight. Her friend laughs quietly and whispers, "That's what hope looks like." You believe her. There's a final gesture now. A guest across the table, old, dignified, perhaps half asleep, dips his finger into the water from the snail basin and touches it gently to his brow. Another copies him. Then another. No one explains it. It doesn't need explanation. This is how rituals work, softly, slowly, seeping into your body before your mind can catch up. The air smells heavier now. Spiced wine, rosewater, hot bronze. You hear a rustle of silk, the distant snort of a horse beyond the garden wall, the faint chime of a servant's anklet. Everything feels suspended. You wonder what sort of omen you've swallowed tonight. What kind of future you've invited by letting so many snails slip down your throat, by watching one crawl its quiet path through lamplight and legend. And in that stillness, it hits you, not like thunder, not like a sign, but like the weight of a single slow breath. Maybe the Romans were right. Maybe the divine isn't loud or fast or grand. Maybe it's slow. Maybe it glistens. Maybe it leaves a trail. You weren't expecting the evening to get philosophical, but here you are, staring at a pair of snail shells that look eerily similar and wondering if someone's just tried to cheat. It starts with a whisper, soft, oily, sliding between the flickers of torchlight and the lazy swirl of diluted wine. "That one's empty," someone mutters behind their cup. "Second time tonight." A guest to your right frowns, turning over a snail shell with an expression usually reserved for discovering forged coinage. He taps it once, twice, then snorts. "There's shell swapping. Bastards." The word hangs in the perfumed air like a heresy. Not because it's vulgar, but because it's possible. You blink. Shell swapping? Apparently so. In a feast where prestige hangs on every coil and curve of a mollusk, deceit has slithered in on a silver tray. Someone serving empty shells, refilled or unfilled, just to stretch the presentation. Maybe the cook is overwhelmed. Maybe the host is cheap. Maybe the snails themselves revolted and slid off the plan. But suddenly, every bite is suspect. You turn your next snail over with exaggerated care. It's full. Warm. Legitimate. You exhale, like a senator checking a voting tablet for tampering. Now, you're paying attention. Not just to the snails, but to the ceremony around them, the delicate flick of the bronze pick, the swirling of sauce before sampling, the reverent pause before swallowing. It's performance. Every diner here is playing a role. The wealthy merchant nods sagely with each bite. The minor poet makes pronouncements like, a touch too time forward, with the authority of a seasoned chef. The older patrician smacks his lips 3 times after each serving, possibly as punctuation, possibly as performance art. And you, well, you're somewhere between bemused and complicit. You're pretending this all makes sense. Because truth be told, the line between snail appreciation and snail obsession got crossed about 4 courses ago. You remember the first few bites, curious, polite, slightly squeamish. And now? Now you're examining shells like a jeweler, sniffing sauces like a perfumer, and, heaven help you, debating whether Numidian or Illyrian snails have more umami backbone. It's around this point that Verus clinks a spoon against his goblet. "A question," he declares, already grinning. "What is the appropriate punishment for falsifying a snail?" The room hums with amusement. Someone says, boiling. Someone else counters, banishment to Britannia. A third voice suggests, feed them only cabbage for a month. You can't tell if they're joking. You also can't tell if the cook has quietly left the room. Because here's your mainstream historical fact, food fraud wasn't just a modern problem. Ancient Rome had an entire office, the aediles, responsible for market regulation, which included checking weights, monitoring stalls, and punishing vendors who tampered with goods. And yes, this extended to luxury foods. Adulterated wine, counterfeit fish sauce, dyed bread, all of it documented. So if someone did try to pass off a reused snail shell at a banquet like this, well, they wouldn't have been executed, but they might have been mocked mercilessly in verse by Martial. Which, let's be honest, is worse. But now for your quirky tidbit, there are rumors, half-whispers in the margins of Roman texts, that some particularly obsessive gourmands would mark snail shells with tiny, colored wax dots to identify them during banquets. Like, snail place cards. 1 blue dot meant it was raised on milk and thyme. 2 dots. Mulled wine and honey. 3 dots. Imported. Possibly illegal. Imagine the moment when a guest bites into a 1-dot snail and realizes it has the texture of a 2-dot. Scandal. Betrayal. Gastronomic treason. It's almost Shakespearean, if Shakespeare had written about gastropods. Here's the scholarly debate. Were these banquets really as elaborate and manipulative as later accounts suggest, or are we simply projecting modern anxieties about food authenticity backward through time? Some historians argue that elite Roman cuisine was highly ritualized and symbolic, with every detail meant to reinforce class and control. Others suggest that many of these tales, of swapped shells, dyed snails, falsified menus, may have been exaggerated by poets and satirists for effect. Satire was, after all, Rome's favorite pastime after conquest. But then again, Apicius's cookbook does include a suspicious number of recipes involving disguising one food as another: liver that looks like fish, fish that tastes like pork, and of course, snails that may or may not be snails at all. So perhaps the paranoia wasn't misplaced. Perhaps the performance was the point. You pause mid-bite, suddenly unsure whether the creamy garlic glaze you're tasting is covering a particularly bold snail or an artfully recarved mushroom. You glance around. No one else seems suspicious. Then again, no one else has been keeping track quite as closely as you have. You sip your watered wine, savor the lingering bite of garlic and fermented lovage, and try not to think about the fact that culinary identity theft might have just happened inside your mouth. But the game continues. The next tray arrives, this one showcasing a selection of historic snails, each allegedly prepared according to ancient recipes recovered from scrolls or mosaics. The Pompeian method, someone calls it, referring to a snail basted in ash and seawater brine. Tiber's delight, someone else says, honey, vinegar, and a whisper of anchovy paste. They're ridiculous. They're delightful. You eat them anyway. One tastes like regret. One tastes like an accident. One tastes like the reason Rome conquered 3 continents. Someone suggests a vote. Best snail of the night, a woman cries. Most poetic, counters the poet. Most suspicious, mutters a military man. Best shell integrity, says someone who's clearly too invested. The discussion continues as the trays are cleared, slowly, like memories dissolving. And now, finally, you feel it, the slow, creeping fullness. Not just of your stomach, but of your senses. Every bite of snail has layered itself like sediment, rich with meaning, flavor, and farce. You've tasted empire. You've tasted anxiety. You've tasted a mollusk dressed in metaphor and gold leaf. And strangely, you're okay with that. The lamps burn lower now, humming softly as if tired. The shadows stretch longer across the mosaic floor. Someone's fallen asleep with a snail pick still in hand. Someone else has begun to hum. You press your fingers to your lips, still faintly slick with oil and thyme, and wonder if any of this was real. Were the flavors that distinct? Were the sauces that subtle? Was the shell you just ate from truly the one that grew around a snail, or a masquerade? In the end, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe all flavor is memory. Maybe all memory is just a well-seasoned lie we tell ourselves at midnight. You lie back, eyes half closed, the soft rustle of silk blending with the sigh of distant wind. A servant passes with rosewater. A final dish is offered, but you wave it away. You've had enough. But just before you drift into the warm fog of sleep and oil and half-remembered geography, you whisper to yourself. Next time, check the shell. By now, your fingers are pruned from too many rinses in lemon water, your palate is a tapestry of oils, herbs, and the persistent shadow of mollusk, and your limbs rest heavy on cushions that feel more like suggestions of furniture than actual seats. The torchlight dances slower now, dimmer, more reluctant, like even fire is growing tired of being polite. There is a lull, not just between courses, but between centuries. Something in the room changes, not in volume, but in weight. The servants shuffle less crisply, the guests recline more deeply, and you catch yourself wondering, softly, if this entire snail affair might one day disappear like all trends do. And you wouldn't be wrong. Because snail fashion, like all fashions, had a peak. And then a decline. And then, very quietly, a kind of cultural extinction. There was no great revolt against the snail. No riot in the forum declaring, no more cocklee. But something shifted. Perhaps it was taste. Perhaps it was war. Or perhaps, as always, it was economics pretending to be aesthetics. But the little gastropods who once graced the tables of emperors, senators, and hopeful social climbers slowly slid off the menu. You hear Verus in the background, still holding court over a dwindling audience. He's recounting, for the second time tonight, how his grandfather once hosted a banquet where every dish was made with snails, snail soup, snail pies, snail-stuffed olives, even snail-infused honey cakes. A few guests laugh, but it's the thin laughter of fatigue. A woman fans herself absently with a fig leaf. A merchant beside you mutters, "These days, even decent snails are hard to find." His tone suggests both nostalgia and relief. You lean back, mind wandering, not just through your own evening, but through the history of this curious Roman obsession. See, there was a time, not long ago, when the possession of a private cochlearia was a mark of elite refinement. Wealthy citizens competed not only in how many snails they served, but in the uniqueness of their breeds, the originality of their sauces, even the personality of their presentation. There are frescoes, now faded, that show snail banquets where each mollusk had its own little garnish hat. Pliny, again, wrote with bemusement about a patrician who named his snails after Greek philosophers. Socrates was a bit too chewy, he joked, or maybe complained. But the fall came slowly, and it came from several directions. First, there was the matter of cost. Snail farming, while once a mark of luxury, became cumbersome. Land use shifted. More space was needed for vineyards, wheat, and livestock. Snail pens, delicate, high maintenance, and vulnerable to theft or weather, lost their appeal. Too much water, not enough meat, grumbled one commentator, likely a chef who had burned his fingers one too many times trying to flambe a reluctant gastropod. Then there was competition. As Rome expanded its culinary horizons, it encountered new foods that thrilled the palate and demanded less effort. Oysters surged in popularity. Their briny boldness felt more dramatic, more modern. Peacocks, stuffed, painted, refeathered, offered theatrical grandeur. And then came flamingo tongues, parrotfish livers, and whatever strange creature a new province could contribute. Snails began to seem, well, provincial. A bit quaint. Like powdered wigs in a world suddenly discovering jazz. And finally, though no one likes to admit it, there was the plague. Not a specific one, just the recurring specter of disease that haunted late Roman society. Sanitation fears grew. People began to whisper that snails, slow and close to the soil, carried more than just flavor. One rumor claimed a senator died from eating a spoiled Numidian snail. Another claimed entire villas had been infested when an unattended snail pen collapsed. Whether true or not, the association was enough to make some households ban the dish entirely. Reputation is a fragile shell. Your mainstream fact. By the 3rd century CE, references to snail dishes in elite menus and surviving recipe fragments dropped significantly. While Apicius's early culinary texts celebrate the snail with enthusiasm, later writings give them passing, sometimes dismissive mentions, if they appear at all. A few even include euphemistic instructions like, prepare as you would the former fashion, a culinary shrug to a bygone era. Banquets shifted focus. Courses became lighter, more digestible. Feasts shortened, guests sobered. And slowly, the snail was no longer the star. Your quirky tidbit: at one point, in the declining years of snail chic, a Roman satirist wrote a fictional eulogy for a beloved garden snail named Lucilla. In the poem, Lucilla is described as swifter than senators in decision, softer than the empress's robe, and wiser than any man who thinks a snail is just food. It ends with a funeral scene in which the snail is buried in a walnut shell and mourned by 12 weeping figs. Scholars still debate whether this was parody or genuine sentiment, but we do have record that Lucilla the snail was voted most memorable dinner guest at 3 separate salons. And now the scholarly debate: what really caused the fall of the Roman snail craze? Historians remain divided. Some argue it was purely economic. Snails didn't scale well in a crumbling empire. Others suggest it was symbolic. The mollusk, once a sign of refinement, came to represent decadence, gluttony, and the slow collapse of Roman values. And some propose that the culinary shift was philosophical. As Stoic ideals regained traction, so too did simpler meals, plainer diets, and a suspicion of indulgence. The snail, with its olive oil-soaked, honey-drizzled, saffron-kissed legacy, was simply too much. A luxury out of time. You watch as a servant clears another dish. This time, it's not snail. It's olives. Plain, pit in. The kind you might eat while waiting for a boat. Or a revolution. Or the check. Someone coughs softly. Someone else excuses themselves to find fresh air. The banquet isn't quite over, but it's certainly winding down. A tray of rosewater towels makes its round. You take one. It smells faintly of vinegar and nostalgia. And here, in this moment of postprandial haze, you realize something gentle and strange: the snail, once a dish of ambition and absurdity, has become a ghost. Not quite gone, not quite forgotten, but no longer necessary. It is a memory that lingers not on the tongue, but in the corners of banqueting rooms, in footnotes of dusty cookbooks, in the dreams of Roman chefs who once argued over whether a snail should be paired with pear or peach. A gust of wind slips through the courtyard. A torch sputters, almost in agreement. You recline deeper into the folds of your cushion, eyelids heavy, belly warm. Somewhere, a poet is writing an ode to lost recipes. Somewhere else, a child is chasing a real snail in a garden, laughing. And somewhere deeper still, in the soil beneath a forgotten villa, a little shell lies buried, still coiled, still intact. Waiting. Waiting. By now, your tongue has grown strangely adept at decoding snail textures. Smooth? Must be Tarquinian. Grainy? Probably Gallo-Roman. Smoky? Numidian, surely. You've become a reluctant connoisseur, a quiet expert in a field you never meant to study. And yet, as the next round of wine is poured, thicker now, almost syrupy, you catch the host's eye and realize, the snails tonight weren't just gathered. They were grown. Cultivated. Engineered, even. Because in Rome, even the slowest creatures became part of the fastest growing science, breeding for flavor, for texture, for prestige. It starts quietly, with a whisper from the man reclined across from you, a portly figure with ink-stained fingers and breath that smells faintly of fennel. Verus has a cochlearia on the palatine, he mutters, licking snail sauce from his thumb. South slope. Morning shade. Fed on a mixture of emmer and honey-soaked lavender. He says this the way others might talk about vintage wine. With reverence. With envy. With a hint of gossip. You smile politely, but your mind is already tumbling through the possibilities, a dedicated snail nursery, built not for efficiency, but for elegance. Not for quantity, but control. Here's your mainstream historical fact: elite Romans didn't just eat snails, they bred them with obsessive care. Dedicated cochlearia, or snail farms, were often built close to kitchens but separate from garden plots, ensuring constant access to the choicest mollusks. Some were open-air stone troughs shaded by grapevines. Others were covered pens with wooden slats and brick walls to prevent escape. Snail keepers tracked diet meticulously, logging which greens, grains, or herbal infusions produced the tenderest meat or the plumpest shell. And over time, families developed their own lineages, snails bred from champion ancestors, like livestock. Only slimier. In the corner of the room, a servant enters carrying what looks like a basket of herbs. But inside, nestled in damp moss, are several live specimens. Still in their shells. Still wriggling faintly. One is offered up for viewing, its shell spiraled like a temple dome, its surface glistening with moisture. The host encourages you to touch it. You do. It's cold. It pulses faintly. He smiles. This one's father was fed only goat's milk and coriander, he says. A bit strong, but with the right sauce, divine. You try not to think about what sort of father a snail makes. You nod as though this were perfectly normal conversation. Here's your quirky tidbit: some Roman breeders dyed their snails using wine or herbal soaks, not for taste, but for aesthetic variety. Pliny the Elder mentions snails turned pink from mulled wine diets, or greenish gold from time-rich soil. There were even rumors of sapphire snails fed on crushed lapis lazuli, though most scholars suspect this was either a joke or a mistranslation of something far more reasonable, like beetroot. Still, guests loved the novelty. A host who served 6 differently colored snails in one course wasn't just feeding guests. He was curating an art exhibit. In mucus. And the science didn't stop at feeding. Some breeders noticed that cooler temperatures produced slower growing but more flavorful meat. Others observed that snails fattened in clay containers developed less shell thickness and more muscle. One obsessive even played flute music near his cochlearia, claiming it encouraged spiritual plumpness. That one didn't catch on. But you still imagine a hillside vineyard, snails nestled in rows like grapes, serenaded by a bored servant with a pan flute. Your scholarly debate tonight: how far did this snail breeding science really go? Some historians argue the Roman cochlearia were more symbolic than scientific, status markers rather than true research centers. They compare them to ornamental koi ponds or bonsai trees. Pretty, curated, but hardly experimental. Others, citing surviving agricultural treatises like those of Columella and Varro, argue that snail farming was a genuine proto-science, early selective breeding based on empirical observation. Then there's the third camp, those who believe the lines between food, fashion, and ritual were too blurred in Roman culture to separate science from spectacle. After all, if your snails are sacred, scientific, and sauced in honey, what box do you even tick? You recline further, the cushions swallowing your shoulders, the lamplight softening into amber halos. The basket of live snails has made its way around the room, sparking murmurs of admiration, revulsion, and one small scream when a particularly ambitious snail began an escape attempt. It's caught, gently, by a servant with hands like marble. Returned to its moss bed like a baby in a cradle. Everyone applauds. You sip more wine. Someone across the room begins theorizing about snail reproduction. Someone else interrupts with a scandalous story of a senator who named all his snails after his mistresses. Someone else adds that he once hosted a duel between 2 of them, marked with colored wax on their shells, and took bets. Mine lost, he says mournfully. But only because she was brooding. You laugh quietly. Or maybe the wine laughs through you. The next dish arrives, and it's not snails this time, but it contains them. A custard, subtly savory, flecked with herbs and tiny morsels of snail meat suspended like pearls in honeyed cream. It's good. Startlingly good. The snail is no longer the centerpiece, but an ingredient. A flavor note. A whisper in the background. You wonder, is this what progress looks like? It dawns on you then, snail breeding wasn't just about taste. It was about control. Mastery over nature's slowest creature. Proof that Rome could shape even slime into civilization. It wasn't enough to conquer the world. They had to curate it. Every farm, every pen, every absurd recipe with pine nuts and rosewater, it was all part of that same desire. Dominate. Design. Digest. The man with the ink-stained fingers has fallen asleep, his head lolling gently on a velvet pillow. His hand is still clutching a small booklet, notes, maybe, or breeding logs. You lean over slightly and glimpse a sketch. It's not a snail. It's a diagram of a feeding schedule. Precise. Labeled. Scientific. You wonder how many generations of mollusk it took to produce the perfect texture for tonight's custard. You wonder what future historians will say about this obsession. You wonder how long you've been lying here. The lamp oil is burning low. The room smells like thyme, citrus, and slightly overcooked egg. A dog sighs in its sleep. Somewhere beyond the walls, a fountain trickles. You're full. Not just in the stomach. In the brain. In the strange, slow part of the soul that only mollusks can reach. And there, on the edge of your hearing, comes a final whisper, not from a philosopher, or a chef, or a senator, but from the snail itself, still crawling, still breeding, still being served. Not fast. But eternal. The torches are lower now. You hadn't noticed when they dimmed, only that their light seemed softer, warmer, almost resigned. The breeze through the open courtyard is cooler too, laced with something floral and faintly wet, like laurel leaves after a spring rain. Around the table, guests shift, recline, stretch, sigh. The air feels looser. Less about proving something. More about holding on. You've eaten more than you meant to. Drunk more than you admitted. But you're not uncomfortable, just quiet. Even the musicians, tucked away in a side alcove, have softened their playing to little more than the occasional pluck of string and whisper of reed. The scent of beeswax, wine, and toasted spices lingers in the folds of your tunic. You feel wrapped in it, like a memory just beginning to fade. And then it arrives. No ceremony. No tray. Just one final servant, stepping forward as if from a dream, bearing a single plate. The dish is small. Plain. A matte white with faint hairline cracks, like the shell of something ancient. At its center sits one lone snail, larger than the others. Still in its shell. Glazed with something golden, translucent, and gently steaming. You recognize none of it, and all of it. It doesn't belong to any province, any recipe, any course. It simply is. You lean in. Everyone else does too. Virus doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. This moment speaks for itself. Finality disguised as indulgence. A goodbye disguised as dessert. You are offered the honor. Your pick waits beside the plate, bone-handled, delicately curved, stained with time. You hesitate, but only for effect. Then you reach forward and begin the slow coax. The spiral resists at first. Just a little. Like it knows what this means. Like it's reluctant to be the last. You tug gently. Twist. It slides free. And you begin to eat. This final snail is unlike the others. It's warm, yes, but more than that. It's soft without being weak, tender without losing shape. The texture is velvet and grit, silk and ember. The flavor? At first, it's impossible to place. There's sweetness, honey, maybe. But also something tart. Dried plum. Then depth. Like smoked olive wood and salt from a forgotten coastline. As it spreads across your tongue, you taste a kind of longing. Like homesickness. But not for a place. For a time. The table has gone silent now. You think perhaps everyone is waiting. Watching. Or maybe they're each lost in their own versions of this final moment, retracing tastes and textures like footprints in the sand. You chew slower. You don't want this to end. Not just the snail. The night. Because here's the thing, Roman banquets were never just about eating. They were acts of memory. Of identity. Of power, yes, but also vulnerability. Each course was a mask, a reveal, a statement, a whisper. And now you sit here, full of more than food, staring at an empty shell that once carried a creature slower than thought, and faster than empire. Your historical fact, then, is this: Roman feasts often ended not with extravagance, but with symbolism. A single fruit. A sugared almond. A snail. Something humble to remind the eater that life is a spiral, expanding outward, always returning inward. It wasn't about the quantity. It was about closure. A ritual that said, we've gone far enough. Your quirky tidbit. Some philosophers, Stoics especially, believed that snails were the perfect metaphor for human life. Slow, deliberate, always carrying their home with them. Vulnerable, yet armored. Edible, yet sacred. Seneca once compared the wise man to a snail, claiming true peace came from knowing when to retreat into yourself, and when to emerge. The soul, he said, like the shell, is strongest when quiet. And the scholarly debate? Historians still argue whether this final course, the last snail, as some texts call it, was a real tradition or a later poetic invention. There are scattered references in late Latin sources, inscriptions on banquet tiles, and a single, broken fresco from Pompeii showing a snail on a pedestal surrounded by figs and coins. Some say it was an homage to satiety. Others, a mockery of it. Still others believe the snail symbolized Rome itself, slow to act, impossible to stop, and always eating its way across the world. You set your utensil down. Around you, the guests are stirring. One man claps softly. Another quotes something vaguely epic. Someone else begins humming a lullaby, off-key but oddly perfect. You recline deeper, the cushion warm beneath you. A servant places a small bowl of rosewater beside your elbow, but you ignore it. The scent of that last bite still clings to your lips. You don't want to wash it away. A torch sputters. The wine is gone. The stars outside the villa blink with a lazy confidence, as if they've seen this all before. And maybe they have. The night folds in on itself, slowly. Like a snail retreating. Your body is heavy now. Not with food, but with something slower. Memory, maybe. Or meaning. Your eyelids flutter. The music becomes a suggestion. The laughter a rumor. The cushion a cloud. Somewhere, someone starts to speak, but their voice becomes birdsong. Then wind. Then nothing at all. You dream of spirals. Of gardens. Of tiny troughs carved into limestone and hands dusted in flour and olive oil. You dream of distant provinces. Of letters written in bad Latin, requesting 6 snails and a jar of mustard. You dream of shells that echo not the sea, but history. And in that space between sleep and memory, you taste it again, just once. The last snail on the platter. So now, as the night fully wraps itself around you, and the stars press their quiet faces against the fabric of the sky, there's nothing more to prove. You've tasted time. You've dined with ghosts. You've followed a trail of spiral shells across marble floors and into forgotten gardens. And somehow, in the middle of all that slow chewing and wondering, you've drifted, just a little, into stillness. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath soften. The villa is quiet now. The snails are gone. The laughter has faded into dust motes and echoes. What remains is yours to keep. A memory. A whisper. A story that's both ridiculous and strangely beautiful. The kind you only remember when you're half awake, or dreaming with your eyes open. Feel the cushion beneath you. The warmth in your chest. The small curl of a smile that doesn't need a reason. You are full, but not just with food. With something slower. Something older. A kind of peace that doesn't hurry. Tonight, you didn't just fall asleep to history. You became part of it. Close your eyes. The spiral turns. And you rest, gently, at its center.